I'm James Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and my own mother tried to steal my $42 million inheritance by setting a legal trap with 3 lawyers. Before I tell you how I turned their ambush into their biggest nightmare, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's good to know who's out there listening. It all started with a phone call, the kind that makes the small hairs on your arm stand up before you even know why. My grandfather, Richard Whitmore, had passed away a week earlier. The funeral was a suffocating blur of black suits, insincere condolences, and the cloying scent of lilies. He was the only person in my entire family who had ever truly seen me, the real me, and now he was just gone. A void. The day before the phone call, his longtime lawyer, Mr. Brennan, a man with a face carved from granite and kindness, had called me to his office. In a quiet, somber meeting that felt more like a military briefing than a reading of a will, he informed me that my grandfather had amended his final testament. I was the sole heir to his entire estate. $42 million. The number was so vast it felt like a clerical error, a phantom figure on a page that couldn't possibly belong to me, James Whitmore, the struggling architect. Then my mother called. "James, darling," she cooed into the phone. Her voice was a cascade of honey, but I'd learned over 3 decades that her honey was often laced with arsenic. "I'm so glad I caught you. We need to have a little family meeting. Just to align on things. For Grandpa's sake. It's so important we show a unified front." "Unity?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Unity in my family usually meant everyone agreeing on how to get what they wanted from my grandfather. "Precisely," she said, ignoring my tone. "Your brother Nathan has graciously offered to host at his home tomorrow. 10 a.m. sharp. It's just a formality, really. Our lawyers suggested a pre-litigation mediation, just to avoid any public messiness. It's for the best, you'll see." Pre-litigation mediation. The phrase slammed into me like a physical blow. You don't hold a mediation when there's nothing to mediate. This wasn't a family chat about grief. This was a strategic move, a line being drawn in the sand. I immediately thought of my grandfather's words over one of our last chess games. His voice a low rasp, but his eyes sharp as flint. "Jimmy, never let them see your next move, especially when they think you're just a pawn on the board." "I'll be there," I said, my voice a carefully constructed wall of calm, betraying none of the chaos erupting in my chest. The next morning, I drove to Nathan's house. It was a monstrous McMansion in the wealthiest part of town, a monument to my brother's ambition and my grandfather's generosity, a series of loans that were never meant to be repaid. Every familiar turn of the road tightened a knot of dread in my stomach. Felt less like a drive to a family home and more like a walk down the Green Mile. I parked my modest sedan behind my brother's gleaming German SUV, a stark visual metaphor for our lives. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked up the perfectly manicured stone pathway and pushed the heavy oak door open. And there it was, the trap, laid bare. It wasn't a living room arranged for a family gathering. It was a boardroom. My mother, Helen, sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, dressed in a severe navy blue power suit. She looked like a prosecutor ready for a career-defining trial. On her right sat my brother, Nathan, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face, and his wife, Julia, who clutched a thick binder to her chest like a shield, her expression a mask of cold ambition. But it was the other side of the table that made the air leave my lungs in a silent whoosh. 3 men, all in identical dark, expensive suits, with identical grim expressions and identical leather briefcases. They were sharks, and I had just been thrown into the tank. My mother's mediation was an ambush, and I was the sole target. To understand how I found the strength to even stand in that room, you have to understand the 2 years that led me there. My life had completely imploded. A bitter and painful divorce had hollowed me out, emotionally and financially. My ex-wife had said I lacked ambition, that I was content to be a small-time architect while she wanted the world. Maybe she was right. All I knew was that the divorce left me with a mountain of legal fees and a crater where my self-esteem used to be. The architecture firm I'd poured my heart and soul into was barely staying afloat. I was 32 and felt like a complete failure. So, I did what a lot of people do when they hit rock bottom. I went home. I fled the life I had tried to build and returned to the familiar landscapes of Connecticut. I rented a small, cheap apartment that always smelled faintly of damp, and I tried to figure out how to put the broken pieces of my life back together. That's when I started spending real time with my grandfather. Richard Whitmore was a titan, a man who had forged a steel empire from sheer will and grit. But by the time I came home, he was physically frail. A major stroke 18 months prior had stolen much of his strength and mobility, but his mind remained a fortress. If anything, being confined to his chair had made it even sharper, his thoughts more focused. We spent our afternoons in his study, a sanctuary that smelled of old books, cherry pipe tobacco, and wood polish. Mostly, we played chess. He taught me the game as a boy, a language of strategy and foresight, and now it became our primary mode of communication. With every move on that worn, beautiful board, he wasn't just playing a game. He was imparting a lifetime of wisdom. 3 principles, Jimmy, he'd rasped one rainy afternoon, his long, bony finger tapping the carved head of his king. Everything you need to navigate the world is right here on this board. 3 principles. Tell me, I said, studying my next move. First, he said, capturing one of my pawns without even seeming to look. Listen more than you speak. Let your opponent reveal their strategy, their weaknesses, their fears. Most people can't bear silence. They rush to fill it with their own foolishness. Let them. I remembered a game where he'd let me talk for 10 minutes about my grand strategy, only to dismantle it in 3 silent, brutal moves. He'd listened, and he'd learned everything. Second, he continued, his voice softer. Trust but verify, especially with family. It's the hardest one. You want to believe the best. You should hope for the best. But you must always prepare for the worst. Loyalty is proven through action, Jimmy, not promised in words. I nodded, the truth of his words a dull ache in my chest. My own father, his son, had passed away from a heart attack years ago, and my relationship with my mother and brother had been strained ever since. I was the quiet, artistic one, the dreamer. Nathan was the golden boy, the charismatic heir apparent who was supposed to take over the world. They saw my quiet nature as weakness. My grandfather was the only one who saw it as patience. And third, I prompted, looking up from the board. He met my gaze, and his eyes, though faded, were piercing. The most important move is the one your opponent never sees coming. The one they can't even imagine is possible. You don't win by reacting to their attacks. You win by making their attacks irrelevant. You win the game before it's even over. His health was a roller coaster. Some days he was sharp and witty, others he was tired, his memory a little foggy, which my mother and Nathan were always quick to point out. We both knew his time was a dwindling resource. One afternoon, his hand trembled so much he couldn't grasp his rook. He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of his years. He pulled a small, crisp business card from his wallet and pushed it across the board to me. Felt like he was passing me a key. The card read, P.I. Miller, Private Investigations. Discretion is our specialty. What's this for, Grandpa? I asked, a knot of confusion and dread tightening in my gut. I started a game a while ago, Jimmy, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A long, quiet game, to find out where the leaks are in this old ship. But I don't think I have the strength to see it through to checkmate. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. If something happens to me, find this man. He has the rest of the board mapped out. He'll help you make the next moves. He knows things I was too much of a coward to confront head-on. I pocketed the card, a cold dread settling over me. I didn't understand the full, terrifying meaning of his words then. I just knew it was the warning of a dying king to his last trusted piece on the board. He saw the storm that was coming. I was still just looking at the clouds. My family always operated on a strange, unspoken caste system, and I was perpetually at the bottom. Nathan was the prince, the one destined for greatness despite all evidence to the contrary. I was The court jester, maybe. The one they tolerated with a kind of bemused condescension but never, ever took seriously. Their dismissiveness wasn't a single, grand act of cruelty. It was a lifetime of 1,000 tiny cuts. I'm thinking of one specific Sunday dinner, a few months before my grandfather's final decline. These were mandatory family gatherings that felt more like a parole hearing, presided over by my mother. That evening, Nathan was holding court as usual, swirling a glass of obscenely expensive red wine my grandfather had paid for. He was pontificating about his latest high-risk real estate venture. "It's a guaranteed home run," he announced to the table, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "We're projecting a 200% return in 18 months. You have to spend money to make money." My mother, Helen, beamed at him as if he'd just discovered a cure for cancer. "Oh, Nathan, that's absolutely wonderful. You always had your grandfather's brilliant head for business." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I knew for a fact that Nathan had burned through his entire college fund. A vast, generous sum from our grandfather intended for an MBA on a spectacularly failed tech startup in his 20s. He'd been floating on a steady stream of loans and investments from the family coffers ever since. But in my mother's eyes, his failures were just daring attempts at success. He could do no wrong. Later, desperate to contribute something to the conversation beyond passing the salt, I mentioned a small but prestigious design award I'd recently won. It was for a pro bono project, a community library in a low-income neighborhood. "It was a real honor," I said, a small flicker of pride in my voice. "We managed to create a beautiful, functional space on a shoestring budget. The kids in the neighborhood love it." Helen waved her hand dismissively, not even bothering to look up from her filet mignon. "That's nice, dear," she said, her tone making it clear it was anything but. "But does that kind of charity work even come with a decent salary? You can't build a future on little awards and feeling good about yourself." The comment landed with a dull, familiar thud. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty, the effortless way she could diminish my accomplishments. The unspoken message was clear. My work, my passion, had no real value because it didn't come with a 7-figure price tag. My success wasn't the kind she could brag about at her country club. Across the grand dining room, I caught the eye of Walter Jenkins, my grandfather's butler. Walter had been with the family for 40 years. He was a quiet, dignified man of few words, but he missed nothing. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice. It was a tiny gesture, but it meant the world to me. Later that evening, as I was leaving, he stopped me at the door, holding my coat. "Mr. James," he said in his low, steady voice, "don't you mind them one bit. Your grandfather is very, very proud of you. He keeps a framed photo of that library you designed on his desk. Tells everyone who visits about it." Walter's small act of kindness was a lifeline in an ocean of familial indifference. It was a quiet reminder that someone saw my worth, even if my own mother couldn't. Her hypocrisy was a constant presence. I remember once, I overheard her complaining to Julia in the kitchen, thinking I was out of earshot. "I sacrificed my entire youth for my father and this family," she lamented, her voice thick with resentment. "I managed this house, I hosted his endless business dinners, I raised 2 boys, and my husband passed so young. And what do I get for it? He still treats me like an employee. I deserve my share. I've more than earned it." That deep-seated sense of entitlement was the engine for everything that came next. She didn't see her actions as theft. She saw them as collecting a debt she felt she was owed. That twisted, self-serving logic was more frightening than simple greed. It was a crack in the very foundation of our family, and I was about to find out it was deep enough to swallow us all. Now, sitting in that ambush room, facing those 3 lawyers, it all clicked into a sickeningly clear picture. This wasn't a new development. It was just the final, most brazen act in a lifetime of being sidelined, dismissed, and chronically underestimated. My reverie was broken by the lead lawyer, a man named Robert Chun. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound in the silent room. His voice was as cold and sterile as a hospital corridor. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, "we are here today because the family has legitimate and serious concerns. Concerns about your grandfather's state of mind when he amended his last will and testament." The battle had officially begun. The air in the room grew colder, thicker, each word from the lawyer chipping away at the temperature. Robert Chun, the apparent lead counsel for the prosecution, spoke with a rehearsed, passionless calm that made my skin crawl. He laid out their case like he was arguing a routine motion in court, not participating in the systematic destruction of a family. "As you know, Mr. Whitmore," Chun said, his hands steepled in front of him, "Mr. Richard Whitmore suffered a significant stroke approximately 18 months ago. It is the family's considered position, supported by expert medical opinion, that his cognitive functions were, thereafter, materially compromised. He was, to put it plainly, highly susceptible to outside influence." Outside influence. The words hung in the air, pointed directly at me. I was the outsider in my own family, the influence that had to be eradicated. My mother, Helen, seized her cue, her voice now filled with a manufactured, quivering concern. "James, we all saw it," she said, turning to me as if we were allies. "He was so confused at times. He would forget names, dates. We were all so terribly worried about him. He wasn't himself. It was a masterful performance." She looked every bit the devoted, heartbroken daughter, wringing her hands with feigned worry. But I looked past the crocodile tears and saw the glint of cold steel in her eyes. This was business. Then came their parade of evidence. Chun slid a document across the table. It was a signed statement, a letterhead from Dr. Eleanor Morrison, my grandfather's primary care physician. I scanned the page. It was a tapestry of medical jargon, woven together to create a single, damning picture: diminished capacity, impaired executive judgment, significant memory lapses, vulnerability to suggestion. I knew Dr. Morrison. She was a competent doctor but a timid, non-confrontational woman. I couldn't imagine her willingly signing her name to such a definitive, career-risking statement unless she was under immense pressure or duress. Next, my sister-in-law, Julia, opened her thick binder with a dramatic, theatrical flourish. The sound of the rings snapping open echoed in the quiet room. "We also have compelling testimony from his primary caregiver, Margaret Winters," she announced, her voice dripping with false sympathy, as if she were a news anchor reporting on a tragedy. Julia began to read a statement from the nurse. Every word was technically true but maliciously twisted. It claimed that I had held long, secretive conversations with my grandfather, often dismissing the nurse from the room under flimsy pretexts. It noted that my visits had increased in frequency in the months just before the will was amended. It painted a portrait of a manipulative parasite, systematically isolating and preying on a vulnerable old man. I could practically picture the scene. Julia and Helen cornering Margaret, a single mother with 2 kids and a mortgage, threatening her job, her professional license, her entire livelihood, if she didn't sign the statement they'd so helpfully prepared for her. When she finished with the nurse's statement, Julia launched into her own observations. She had a timeline, a logbook of my comings and goings, that she must have been compiling for months. "On August 14th, she read, her finger tracing the line on the page, "James spent 4 hours alone with Richard in his study. The very next day, August 15th, phone records show Richard placed a 30-minute call to his lawyer, Mr. Brennan's office." She presented this as if it were a smoking gun, irrefutable proof of my villainy. It was nothing more than a collection of meaningless facts woven into a narrative of pure deceit. I just listened. I let them talk. I held on to my grandfather's first principle like a life raft. Listen more than you speak. Let them reveal their own foolishness. And they were. They were so confident in their story, so certain of their power, that they weren't just showing me their strategy. They were showing me their souls. And their souls were rotten to the core. Nathan, who had been silent until this point, finally decided to play his part. The reasonable, responsible older brother. He leaned forward, attempting a look of sincere concern. "Look, James," he said, his voice soft and placating. Nobody is saying you did this maliciously. We know you were emotional. He was emotional. Things got confused in his head. We just want to make things right. To honor what Dad really would have wanted for the family as a whole. That, he meant our grandfather. The man whose money he'd been living off of for 2 decades without producing a single success of his own. The hypocrisy was so potent it was almost a physical presence in the room. I just sat there, my expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, letting them build their own gallows, one lie at a time. I could feel their frustration mounting with my silence. They had expected me to yell, to protest, to break down and cry. They didn't know I was playing an entirely different game. They were playing checkers, focused on jumping my pieces. I was playing chess. And my grandfather had already taught me the winning move. After they had laid out their mountain of fabricated evidence. After the last lie had been told, Robert Chun slid a final, ominous document across the polished table. The wood felt cold and dead under my fingertips. This, he said, his voice unervingly smooth, is a solution, a way to handle this entire unfortunate matter privately, with dignity, and without resorting to a messy and public court battle. We're calling it a voluntary reallocation agreement. I picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive, with the embossed letterhead of a top-tier law firm. It smelled of ink and betrayal. I didn't need to read the pages of dense, legalistic jargon. My mother spelled it out for me, her voice now firm and businesslike. The loving, concerned mother act dropped in favor of the shrewd CEO closing a deal. It's very simple, James, she said, her eyes hard. The entire $42 million inheritance, as it stands, will be placed into a new, irrevocable family trust. For the sake of stability and experience, I will be the sole trustee. For your continued support, the trust will grant you an annual salary of $50,000. It's a very generous offer, all things considered. It protects the family legacy and ensures you're taken care of for life. $50,000. Pittance. Less than a junior architect's starting salary. It was a dog biscuit thrown to keep me quiet while they feasted on the massive fortune my grandfather had built with his bare hands. It wasn't an offer. It was a final, crushing insult. It was a declaration of exactly how little they thought of me, how worthless they believed I was. I looked from my mother's hard, unyielding face to my brother's smug, triumphant one. He was already spending the money in his head. I said nothing. I just held the document, feeling its weight. The silence in the room stretched, growing thick and uncomfortable for them. This was the part where I was supposed to crumble, to see the futility of fighting such a united, powerful front. Julia, ever the enforcer, decided it was time to apply the final turn of the screw. She leaned forward, her voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for me, but loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. You should really think about this very carefully, James, she said, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. Your little architecture firm, it's a bit fragile right now, isn't it? After the divorce and all. That big contract you just landed with the Reynolds Corporation, the one that's basically keeping you afloat? It would be a terrible, terrible shame if something were to happen to it. She paused, letting the threat land with its full weight. My uncle, Victor Reynolds, is the chairman of the board. You know that, right? I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about any messy public lawsuits involving his new project architect. A scandal involving accusations of elder abuse and a contested inheritance. That's just not good for business. He might decide to reevaluate the contract. That was it. The kill shot. The final, brutal threat. They weren't just trying to take my inheritance. They were trying to take my career, my future, the one thing I had managed to build for myself out of the wreckage of my life. They were threatening to burn down my tiny lifeboat just to make sure I drowned. I looked down at the expensive, gold-plated pen sitting next to the document. The Judas choice. Sign away my birthright, my grandfather's final act of faith in me, and be allowed to keep my struggling career. Or fight them and risk losing absolutely everything. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the glass of water on the table. It was a small, involuntary betrayal by my own body. I could feel their eyes on me, expectant, victorious. They saw the tremor. They thought they had me. They thought I was checkmated. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire of rage and hurt in my gut. I placed the glass back on the table with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. I looked up, meeting my mother's gaze directly. I didn't look at the lawyers or my brother or his venomous wife. I looked straight at my mother, the architect of this entire betrayal. And in that moment, all the fear, all the hurt, all the years of being made to feel small and insignificant, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard, unbreakable clarity. I pushed the unsigned document and the pen back to the center of the table. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. "Is that all?" I asked. "Are you finished? Because now, it's my turn." Before I tell you what happened next in that room, how the tables turned so violently, I need to take you back with me to the night before. Because I wasn't the calm, cool strategist they saw sitting at that table. I was a man dangling at the end of his rope. The moment I hung up the phone after my mother's invitation to the mediation, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. My hands were shaking. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My first instinct was to call my lawyer, Mr. Brennan, but then I remembered my grandfather's words and the business card he had pressed into my hand. "He'll help you make the next moves." My hand trembled as I dialed the number. The voice that answered was gravelly, tired, and all business. "Miller. Mr. Miller?" I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "My name is James Whitmore. My grandfather, Richard Whitmore, he told me to call you if something happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing," Miller said, his tone softening by a fraction. "He was a sharp old man, one of the sharpest. I was wondering when you'd call. He told me what he was planning. Your family isn't wasting any time, are they?" We agreed to meet that night. His office wasn't in some high-rise building. It was a cluttered, dusty back room above a 24-hour laundromat that smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and regret. P.I. Miller looked exactly like his office. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a roadmap of tough cases, tired eyes that missed nothing, and a trench coat that looked like it had been in a few fights. He was something out of an old detective movie, a relic from another time. "Your grandfather hired me 6 months before his stroke," Miller explained, pushing a thick, worn accordion file across his beaten-up metal desk. "He started noticing discrepancies, small at first, then bigger. He suspected your mother was skimming from his accounts. He just didn't know how deep the rot went. He wanted proof before he confronted her." With a sense of dread, I opened the file. My hands shook so badly I could barely undo the clasp. Inside was a meticulously organized collection of horrors. Copies of bank statements, credit card bills, phony invoices, canceled checks. It was all there, a documented history of a decade-long betrayal. Miller walked me through it, his voice a low, steady drone. "Here," he said, tapping a document. "A $40,000 charge for a complete roof repair on your grandfather's house from a company called Apex Contracting. Thing is, Apex Contracting doesn't exist. It's a shell corporation. We traced the bank account. It leads right back to your mother." He flipped to another page. "And here, a $15,000 purchase for specialized Italian medical equipment. A very specific piece of equipment, apparently, because we found the corresponding charge on her credit card for a first-class trip to Florence for two. Your mother and her brother, your great-uncle Charles. The charge was for $15,012. They didn't even try to hide it well. It went on and on. Phony landscaping fees that paid for her luxury car lease. Household maintenance charges that were actually cash withdrawals made near casinos. A systematic, relentless plundering of the man's fortune, all while smiling in his face. "But it gets worse," Miller said, his expression grim. He pulled out another set of documents. These from a different file labeled Nathan. "Your brother. He and his wife, Julia, got a little more ambitious. They forged your grandfather's signature to use the family estate, the house, the land, everything, as collateral on a $2 million business loan for that ridiculous real estate project of his. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had to brace myself against the desk. The project was a bust, Miller continued, his voice devoid of sympathy. The loan is now in default. The bank was about to start foreclosure proceedings. That's what this mediation is really about. They are desperate. They need to get control of the inheritance to cover their own fraud before the whole thing blows up and they both end up in prison. It wasn't just greed. It wasn't just entitlement. It was raw criminal desperation. Your grandfather found out about the loan just a week before he passed, Miller said, his voice now gentle. Brennan, his lawyer, uncovered it during a routine asset review. I think the news is what broke him. He knew he didn't have the strength or the time for a long, ugly legal fight. So he changed the will. He made you the weapon, kid. His last, best weapon. That night, sitting alone in that cheap, dusty office with Miller, the damning evidence spread out before me like a funeral shroud, I felt the full weight of it all. These were horrible people. They were criminals. But they were also my mother, my brother, my family. I don't know if I can do this, Miller, I confessed, my head in my hands. The thought of facing them, of detonating this bomb in the middle of our lives, was sickening. This will destroy them. It will destroy what's left of our family. Miller sat down opposite me, the springs of his old chair groaning in protest. He looked at me, his weary eyes filled with a surprising kindness. Your grandfather knew that. He wrestled with it. I could hear it in his voice. But he made a choice. He chose the person who valued loyalty over the people who only valued money. He didn't pick you because he thought you were a warrior, kid. He picked you because you're a builder. He knew you'd know what to do with the pieces after the board was cleared. He tapped a small, silver digital audio recorder on the table. He gave this to me, too. A final message. He recorded it the day after he found out about the loan. He said you should play it when the time was right. He then briefed me on his conversation with the nurse, Margaret Winters. He'd approached her quietly, professionally. He'd shown her evidence that Julia had been digging into her private life, making inquiries about her ex-husband and the custody agreement for her 2 children. Clear, unspoken threat. Terrified, but wanting to do the right thing, Margaret had agreed to sign a notarized affidavit detailing the threats and the false statement she was forced to sign. Miller had it, a signed and witnessed legal document. She's too scared to show up in person, he said. And I don't blame her. But her words are here. And sometimes, written words are louder than spoken ones. We spent the next 2 hours planning. It wasn't just about having the evidence. It was about how to present it. The sequence. The timing. First, the audio to establish lucidity. Then, the personal embezzlement to destroy my mother's credibility. Then, the loan fraud to expose their desperation. The affidavit would be the final nail in the coffin. I left Miller's office just before dawn. The fear was still there. A cold, hard stone in my stomach. But now, there was something else alongside it. Cold, hard resolve. A duty. When I walked into that ambush room the next morning, I wasn't calm because I was unafraid. I was calm because I had spent the night staring into the abyss of my family's betrayal, and I had chosen to fight back. I knew my moves. I had all my pieces in place, and I was ready to play the game to its brutal, inevitable end. I let the silence after my declaration hang in the room for a long, heavy moment. It was a silence filled with their shock and my resolve. The 3 lawyers exchanged wary glances. My mother's face hardened into a mask of pure fury, and Nathan and Julia just looked confused, as if a pawn they were about to take off the board had suddenly turned into a queen. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my briefcase. I didn't pull out a folder of papers. Not yet. The sequence was everything. I pulled out the small, silver digital audio recorder Miller had given me and placed it in the exact center of the table. It looked tiny and insignificant in the middle of that vast, polished expanse. "What is that?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and imperious. "What kind of games are you playing, James?" "It's not a game, Mother," I said, my voice steady. It's a voice from the past. I pressed the play button. The room was instantly filled with the sound of my grandfather's voice. It was weak, raspy from his illness, and you could hear the faint whistle of his breathing. But the words were unmistakably clear, lucid, and filled with a weary authority. If you are hearing this, his voice began, the recording stark and clear, it means I am gone, and it means my family is likely behaving exactly as I feared they would, like vultures circling a kill. A collective gasp went through their side of the table. Helen's face, which had been flushed with anger, went chalky white. The lawyers stopped shuffling their papers and froze. I want to be perfectly clear, for the record, my grandfather continued, his voice gaining a surprising strength. My mind is sound. My decision to leave my entire estate, every last penny, to my grandson James Whitmore, is the sanest and most logical decision I have made in years. Why? Because he is the only one who ever came to see me without an invoice in his hand. The air was thick with tension. Helen, my daughter, a woman I love but no longer recognize, only called when she needed money for one of her phony charities or a new car. My grandson, Nathan, only graced me with his presence when one of his half-baked business schemes went belly up and he needed a bailout. They see a walking, talking ATM. James saw a grandfather. He brought me books. He played chess with me. He just sat with me. And he listened. The silence that followed the recording was absolute and deafening. My mother looked as if she'd been slapped. But I wasn't finished. This was just the opening move. That recording, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, was made 1 week before he passed away, with a witness present. It legally confirms his lucidity and his explicit intentions. Now, let's talk about why he felt the need to make it. I finally reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own binder. It was thicker than Julia's. I opened it and slid the first document across the table. It was a copy of a bank statement and a phony, printed invoice. Mother, I said, my voice now devoid of any emotion, let's talk about the $40,000 roof repair you authorized for the house last spring. A house that, according to 3 different professional roofing companies I've had assess it in the last week, has never had a single leak. And let's talk about this company, Apex Contracting, that you paid. Funny thing, the state of Connecticut has no record of its existence. But its bank account, which I have the records for right here, traces back to a shell corporation. And you are the sole signatory on that account. Her jaw dropped. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for a response. I slid another set of documents over to her. Or how about we discuss the $15,000 for specialized Italian medical equipment? A very specific amount, because it happens to be the exact cost, to the penny, of the first-class vacation to Florence you and Uncle Charles took last year. I have the receipts for both. They match perfectly. I then turned my full attention to my brother and his wife. Nathan, Julia, your turn. I pushed the bundle of loan documents Miller had uncovered in front of them. $2 million. You forged my grandfather's signature on a personal guarantee. That's a federal crime. The loan is in default. The bank was a week away from starting foreclosure proceedings on this very house. You weren't trying to protect the family legacy. You were trying to save yourselves from bankruptcy and prison. Julia scoffed, a desperate, brittle sound. This is absurd. Slander. You have no proof of any of this. Oh, but I do, I said calmly. And I have more. You threatened his nurse, Margaret Winters, a single mother. You tried to use her children's custody situation against her. I held up a single, notarized sheet of paper. This is her sworn affidavit, detailing your threats and the false statement she was coerced into signing. She was too afraid to be here in person, Julia. Too afraid of what a monster like you might do to her family. The lawyers were now pale, whispering furiously to my mother. The ambush had not just failed. The trap had snapped shut on the hunters. It was checkmate. The entire dynamic of the room had shattered. The carefully constructed facade of power and control had crumbled into dust. The 3 lawyers, who had entered the room like conquering heroes, were now in full-blown panic mode. "Helen, do not say another word," Chen hissed, frantically stuffing papers into his expensive leather briefcase. His two colleagues were doing the same, avoiding my gaze as if looking at me might incriminate them further. Nathan, my golden boy brother, crumbled completely. The smugness vanished, replaced by the terrified face of a child who had been caught. He slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, and began to sob loud, ugly, gasping sobs of pure self-pity. "I'm ruined," he choked out between breaths. "It was just a bad investment. The market turned. Everything's gone. I didn't know what else to do." His confession, pathetic and damning, hung in the air. Julia, however, was a cornered snake. When a snake is cornered, it doesn't surrender. It looks for one last chance to strike. She wasn't defeated. She was just angrier. Her face was a mask of pure venom. She whipped out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with furious speed. "You think you're so clever, don't you, James?" she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You'll regret this. My uncle will hear about this right now. Your pathetic little architecture career will be over by lunchtime. You'll be untouchable." I held up a hand, a simple gesture to stop her. "Don't bother, Julia," I said, my voice weary. "I already spoke to your uncle." Her head snapped up, her fingers frozen over the screen. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. "I met with Victor Reynolds last week," I explained calmly, savoring the look of shock on her face. "I didn't mention you. I didn't mention this meeting or any family drama. I simply went to him as a professional. I walked him through my designs, the cost-saving measures I'd already implemented, and the updated timeline for the project. He was impressed by the work. The actual work. My contract is secure, Julia. It's based on merit, not on who I'm related to. You have no power over me. You never did." That was the final blow. Her face, a mask of righteous rage just moments before, crumpled into a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. The last weapon in her arsenal was a dud. The last ounce of leverage she thought she had just evaporated into thin air. All the fight went out of them. The lawyers made their hasty excuses and practically ran from the room, abandoning their clients in the smoldering wreckage. Nathan was still sobbing like a child. Julia just stared into space, her phone clattering from her limp hand onto the table. Defeated. And then I looked at my mother. She sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly on the table, her face a blank, unreadable slate. The evidence of her crimes, her son's raw pain, the complete collapse of her meticulously laid plans. It all seemed to wash over her without leaving a trace. But I needed one more thing. Not for the lawyers, not for the inheritance. For me. For the boy who had spent his entire life trying to win an ounce of her approval. I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of her. My voice was quiet, stripped of all its anger and fire, leaving only a raw, aching hurt that felt like it was being ripped from my soul. "I just have one question, Mom," I said, my own voice threatening to break. "Forget the money. Forget all of this." I leaned in closer, forcing her to look at me. "In all these years, was there ever a single time you were actually proud of me? Or was I always just a disappointment compared to him?" I gestured with my head towards my weeping, broken brother. She looked up at me. Her eyes were empty. There was no apology, no remorse, not even a flicker of anger. There was just nothing. A void. She couldn't answer the question. She wouldn't answer the question. And in her cold, devastating silence, I finally got my answer. It was the most painful and the most profoundly freeing moment of my entire life. The mask was gone forever. The illusion of family had been burned away, and all that was left was the cold, hard, and undeniable truth. With my final question hanging in the air unanswered, a new kind of silence descended upon the room. It wasn't tense anymore. It was dead. The silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. The war had ended, and the victors were not celebrating. I took a step back from my mother, the space between us now feeling like an unbridgeable chasm, a canyon carved by years of lies and neglect. Nathan's choked sobs were the only sound in the cavernous room, a pathetic punctuation to the end of his reign as the golden boy. Julia, for her part, looked like a statue, frozen in the moment of her ultimate defeat, her face a mixture of shock and contempt aimed squarely at her blubbering husband. I turned my attention back to my mother, one last loose thread to tie off. My voice was flat now, matter-of-fact, like a coroner reading a report. It was Uncle Charles, wasn't it? Her head twitched, a tiny, involuntary flicker of surprise in her dead eyes. It was the first genuine reaction she'd shown. The Shell Corporation, Apex Contracting, the one the money for the fake roof repair went into, I continued, reciting the facts from Miller's meticulous files. It was established 20 years ago. The co-signatory on the original bank account before you took it over completely was your brother, our great-uncle Charles. He was always so bitter, wasn't he? Living in Grandpa's shadow. He was jealous of Grandpa's success, so he helped you bleed him dry from the inside. He taught you how. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Her faint, almost imperceptible nod was all the confirmation I needed. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was a conspiracy that spanned a generation. A rot that had started long before I was even born, festering in the dark corners of our family. I took a long, final look at the three of them. My family shattered and exposed in the wreckage of their own greed. I had expected to feel triumph. I had expected to feel a rush of righteous vindication. Instead, I just felt an immense, hollowing sadness, a profound grief, not for the people in front of me, but for the family I thought I had, the one I had always wished for as a child. That family had never really existed. It was just a story I had told myself. I walked back to my side of the table and began to pack my briefcase. I slid my binder of evidence inside, the papers feeling heavy and toxic. I pocketed the small audio recorder. Each movement was deliberate, final, a ritual of closure. When I was done, I stood up straight, my back a little straighter than it had been when I'd walked in. This inheritance, I said, my voice clear and steady, addressing the entire room but making eye contact with no one. I will be accepting it. I will be managing it. Not because of the money. I don't give a damn about the money. I'm doing it because it is the last responsibility my grandfather gave me. It was his final act of trust in a world of betrayal, and I will not let him down. I looked at Nathan, still crying into his hands, at Julia, who was staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, at my mother, who hadn't moved a muscle. As for the three of you, I said, my voice as cold as the room had become, what you do next is up to you. You can try to fight this in court, and I will submit every single piece of this evidence to a judge. The loan fraud, the embezzlement, the conspiracy. It will all become public record. Your friends at the country club will have a field day. I let that sink in. Or you can walk away, disappear, and deal with the consequences of your actions on your own. I didn't need to say more. We all knew there was no fight left in them. They were beaten. I turned and walked towards the grand, oversized door, my footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. I left them there, sitting in the ashes of the empire they had tried to steal, buried in the ruins of the family they had systematically destroyed. As I stepped out of the oppressive gloom of the house and into the bright, clean sunlight, I didn't feel like I had won anything. I felt like I had survived a fire, and now I had to figure out how to live with the burns. The 3 months that followed that day were a study in deconstruction and rebuilding. The first thing to go was the mansion, that monument to my family's dysfunction. I worked closely with my grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Brennan, a steady and reassuring presence, to liquidate the estate. The massive house, full of ghosts and bad memories, was sold to a developer. I kept only a few precious things. My grandfather's extensive collection of classic literature, his favorite worn leather armchair that still smelled faintly of him, and the beautiful hand-carved wooden chess set we had spent countless hours over. Everything else was just stuff. I couldn't stay in Connecticut. The whole state felt haunted by the ghosts of who I used to be. Every road held a memory, every landmark a story I needed to forget. I needed a fresh start, a place where I wasn't Richard Whitmore's grandson or Helen Whitmore's son, a place where I could just be James. On Miller's recommendation, I packed up my life into a few dozen boxes and moved across the country to Portland, Oregon. He said the constant gray drizzle would be good for my soul. It washes things clean, he'd said. He was right. I bought a small, modest house with a large, hopelessly overgrown garden that needed a tremendous amount of work. It was perfect. The money, the $42 million, sat in a managed account, an intimidating and alien number on a screen. For weeks, I didn't even look at it. It felt like blood money, the prize in a brutal battle I never wanted to fight. So I ignored it. I spent my days in the garden, waging a war on weeds and invasive blackberry bushes. I turned soil, built raised beds, and felt the cool, damp earth under my fingernails. It was real. It was honest work. It was grounding. Slowly, as my hands healed and the garden began to take shape, an idea began to form. It started with a phone call from Walter, the old butler, who had called just to check in on me. He'd retired to Florida after the estate was sold. "You know, Mr. James," he'd said in his gentle, dignified voice, "what happened to your grandfather? It happens to a lot of good people. They get old, their families get greedy, they get isolated, and they don't have anyone in their corner to fight for them." He was right. My grandfather had the immense resources to hire a man like Miller. Most people didn't. They were alone. That's when it hit me with the force of a revelation. I wasn't just an architect who designed buildings of wood and steel. I was a builder. I could build a defense. I could build a shield for people like my grandfather. I called P.I. Miller. "I have a crazy idea," I said, the words tumbling out of me. "It's probably impossible, but I have to try." A week later, Miller, grumbling about the rain, flew out to Portland. We sat in my messy, half-unpacked living room, surrounded by boxes of books. I laid out my plan for him, a unique consulting firm, not just another financial planning service, but a holistic protection agency for the elderly. We'd offer a three-pronged service: expert legal counsel to lock down their estate, scrupulous financial oversight to watch for red flags, and, when necessary, discreet private investigation services to root out fraud and exploitation, especially from within their own families. A shield, forged in the fire of my own painful experience. Miller, a man I'd never seen show much enthusiasm for anything, listened intently. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, a rare, genuine smile spread across his weary face. "It's a hell of an idea, kid," he said. "A damn good one. I'm semi-retired, but for something like this, something that actually does some good in this rotten world, count me in as a consultant." And so we began. The process was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was an endless mountain of forms, licensing requirements, legal hurdles, and financial regulations. It was far harder than designing any building. But for the first time in years, I felt a deep, abiding sense of purpose that had nothing to do with winning an award or landing a contract. I was building something that mattered. I even convinced Walter to join our advisory board to help consult with clients on family dynamics. His decades of quiet, dignified observation had made him an unparalleled expert in the subtle art of reading people. We were a strange, unlikely team: a disgraced architect, a cynical private investigator, and a retired butler. We were the guardians, and we were just getting started. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was knee-deep in the legal paperwork for incorporating the Whitmore Shield, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my brother, Nathan, standing on my porch. The sight of him was a shock. He looked diminished. The arrogance and entitlement that had been his defining characteristics were gone, stripped away, leaving behind a deep-seated weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. He'd lost weight. The expensive suit and designer watch were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn-out jacket that looked too thin for the Oregon chill. "Nathan?" I said, my voice filled with a surprise I couldn't hide. How did you find me? Sold Mom's old car, he said, his voice quiet, raspy. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Used the money for a bus ticket. I had to. I needed to see you. We stood in an awkward, heavy silence for a moment, the chilly breeze rustling the leaves around us. I'm not here to ask for anything, he finally said, looking down at his worn-out sneakers. He held out his hand. In his palm was the gold Rolex my grandfather had given him for his college graduation. It was the one thing of value he had left. I sold everything else to pay off some immediate debts, he mumbled. But I couldn't sell this. It was never really mine to sell. You should have it. He tried to press it into my hand. I curled my fingers into a fist and didn't take it. I don't want the watch, Nathan, I said, my voice softer than I expected. He looked up then, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate despair I'd never seen before. The golden boy was gone. All that was left was a broken man. I'm sorry, James, he whispered, his voice cracking. God, I am so sorry. For everything. I was weak and I was stupid and I was a coward. I'm so sorry. For the first time in my life I believed him. He wasn't just sorry he got caught. He was sorry for what he had done. I went inside, my mind racing. I came back with my checkbook. I wrote him a check for a modest amount. Not enough to solve his problems, but enough to give him a fighting chance. Enough for a deposit on a cheap apartment and a few months' rent. I handed it to him along with a business card for a therapist I'd found in his area back east. This isn't a gift, Nathan, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. This is a loan. It's the first step. That's all it is. You need to go to therapy. You need to get a job, any job, and start taking responsibility. You need to face what you did. Redemption isn't something I can give you. It's not for sale. You have to earn it for yourself, one day at a time. When you're clean, when you're standing on your own 2 feet, then you can call me. He took the check and the card, tears welling in his eyes and streaming down his face. He nodded, unable to speak, then turned and walked away down the path without another word. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was real. It was a chance. That night, as I was finally unpacking the last of my grandfather's books, a small, black USB drive fell out from between the pages of his well-worn copy of The Art of War. My heart skipped a beat. I plugged it into my laptop. It was a single video file. I clicked it, and my grandfather's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired, older than I remembered, but his eyes were bright and focused. James, he began, his voice a familiar, comforting rasp. If you're seeing this, it means you won the game, and I have never been more proud. I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry I had to put you through such an ordeal. I was a fool. I let the rot in this family grow for too long because I didn't want to believe my own child, my own brother, could be capable of such profound deceit. But my time ran out. This was my last move. The inheritance was never the prize, son. It was the weapon. It was the test. And you passed. Now, take what I've given you and don't just protect it. Build something good with it. Build a legacy of your own. The video ended. And in the quiet of my new home, I finally understood. The whole ordeal wasn't a curse he had left me. It was his final, greatest gift. A mission. It's been a year since that day in the ambush room. A year since my old life burned to the ground. The firm, the one I dreamed up in my grief and anger, is real. We officially incorporated and named it the Whitmore Shield. Felt right. We have our first real client. An 80-year-old woman named Mrs. Gable. A retired music teacher with bright, intelligent eyes clouded by fear. Her son is trying to get power of attorney, claiming she's incompetent, so he can sell her house from under her and use the money to fund his failing business. Her story is so painfully familiar it makes my teeth ache. When she tells me her story, her voice trembling, I see my own grandfather in her eyes, and I know with absolute certainty how to fight for her. I know all the moves. My life is quiet now. Simple. I spend my days working with Miller and Walter, building our shield brick by brick. I spend my evenings in the garden, which is now thriving, or in my grandfather's armchair, reading one of his books. The $42 million is no longer an intimidating, alien number on a screen. It's a tool. It's a resource. It's the fuel to fund the fight for people like Mrs. Gable, people who can't fight for themselves. I haven't spoken to my mother. She lives with my great-uncle Charles now. According to a holiday card Walter received, they travel a lot, moving from one sunny, expensive location to another. I try not to think about them. It's like a phantom limb. I know something is missing, but the pain is starting to fade. Nathan calls me once a month. He's working a grueling construction job. He's paying back his debts, starting with the therapist. The conversations are short, awkward, but they're honest. He tells me about his day, the blisters on his hands. He never asks for anything. Maybe one day he'll be a brother again. Maybe. Every now and then, on a quiet evening, I take out the old wooden chessboard. I set up the pieces. The smooth, heavy would cool and familiar beneath my fingers. I don't play a full game. I just sit there, looking at the board, the 32 pieces poised for battle. I no longer see it as the end of my grandfather's story. I see it as the beginning of mine. He didn't just teach me how to win a single, brutal game. He taught me how to clear the board and start a new one. How to make the first move, clear-eyed and with purpose, knowing exactly what you're fighting for. And my game, my real game, is just beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up to your own family to do what was right? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.